This story is probably one of the most horrific that I've ever told. It's a story that was common, but also one that should not have happened. However, the history behind this story should anger you more than what happened to this black family. Before I get into what happened to the Nelson family in 1911, I have to provide you with some history. This history is crucial to understand the Supreme Court and how it allowed Jim Crow and put black people on a path that we were never supposed to be on. I encourage you to watch this video fully. This is an important part of black history that you must know. And I promise you, you will not be disappointed if you watch to the end. Slavery not only brutalized and dehumanized black people, but it also made black people invisible. The period that followed the Civil War was the Reconstruction period. It is the most crucial period in American history for black people. Because during Reconstruction, the United States made its first attempt at trying to build a country based on equality on the ruins of slavery. The Reconstruction Congress sought to provide newly freed black people with access to the courts and to voting rights and public accommodations. It also sought to protect newly freed black people from the violence that was being carried out against black people in the South. Congress greatly expanded the power of the federal government more than it had ever done before. In many ways, this period was like the second founding of our country. The second founding put the federal government as a custodian of freedom for newly freed black people. The second founding began with the passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. Without the 13th Amendment, slavery would have continued. The Emancipation Proclamation that President Lincoln signed did not by itself abolish slavery. It only set free enslaved black people in the areas that it applied to where Confederate states were in rebellion to the Union. Abolition was necessary because a proclamation could be reversed by future presidents or by the courts. There was a real fear that the Supreme Court might later invalidate the Emancipation Proclamation. The 13th Amendment was the first amendment in the nation's history to expand the power of the federal government rather than restraining the power of the federal government. I'm not going to get deep into the 13th Amendment in this video because we'd be here too long if I did. I'm going to talk more about it in a video we're doing for Juneteenth later on. During the second founding, the 14th Amendment was also added to the Constitution. Its purpose was to establish the rights of newly freed black people by creating a uniform definition of citizenship and guaranteeing black people equal protection under the law. When Congress passed the 14th Amendment, it believed that it had the power to outlaw private acts to interfere with the promise of guaranteeing equal protection to the newly freed black population. This included racially motivated violence and excluding black people from public spaces through segregation. The second founding also saw the passage of the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the newly freed black population the right to vote. The Reconstruction Congress saw the 15th Amendment as the completion of the second founding. They believed that they had set the country on the path towards equality where newly freed black people could walk out of the past of slavery and into the promise of an equal future. But as soon as these amendments were passed, Southern states went to work in trying to keep black people into second-class citizenship. They passed black codes that criminalized every aspect of black life so that they could put black people back into chains and work them for profit. Violence against black people started occurring all across the South. The Klan rose up at this time and began its reign of terror on black people. The central question became, did the new second founding amendments protect black people from these private acts of violence that were occurring? The Reconstruction Congress believed that they did and went even further and passed more legislation to protect black people. In 1870 and 1871, Congress passed 3 enforcement acts that were designed to use federal power to stop the violence and discrimination that the South was inflicted on black people and to enforce the power of the 13th and the 14th Amendments. One of those enforcement acts was the Civil Rights Act of 1875. This act was designed to protect black people from the violence and discrimination that was being carried out by individuals and groups in the South. And the federal government used these acts to prosecute violators. Between 1871 and 1873, federal prosecutors brought over 2,000 criminal cases under these enforcement acts. Then something changed in 1877. The federal government abandoned black people. In exchange for winning the presidency, Republican Rutherford Hayes agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South and let Southern states control their own affairs. This ushered in the Jim Crow era. After the federal government abandoned black people, the Supreme Court went even further to leave black people to violence and segregation. Remember how I said that the Reconstruction Amendments were designed to protect black people and guarantee them equal rights and treatment? Well, the Supreme Court disagreed and didn't feel that way. The Supreme Court felt that black people should stand on their own feet and that federal power should not be used to help black people who were only recently out of slavery. In a series of cases in the 1880s, the Supreme Court set the stage for what would become the most violent and traumatizing and dehumanizing era for black people in this country. The court created what is known as the State Action Doctrine. It said that the Reconstruction Amendments only applied to states and not private people. In the 1873 case called United States versus Cruikshank, the court overturned the convictions of a white mob that massacred dozens of black men in Colfax, Louisiana, because it said that these were private acts and not acts done by the state of Louisiana. In the 1883, in the 8-1 decision, the court put the death knell in the Reconstruction Amendments and the legislation designed to help black people. In 1883, in a collection of cases called the Civil Rights Cases, the Supreme Court held that the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which was passed in response to the violence from the Klan and the racial discrimination in the South, it said that it was unconstitutional. The court said that the 14th Amendment only prohibited state actions of discrimination, not individual acts of racial discrimination. The court held that the 14th Amendment did not authorize Congress to legislate against private discrimination and private conduct, thereby limiting the scope of federal protection for black people in the South. The court feared that allowing Congress to control private actions would undermine Southern state legislatures' right to govern themselves. One justice dissented, Justice John Marshall Harlan, a former slave owner. Justice Harlan pointed out that the court was more than willing to help private slave owners enforce the fugitive slave laws when enslaved black people ran away, but not willing to protect these same black people from those same former slave owners who sought to re-enslave black people. The decision was met with widespread outrage and disappointment amongst African Americans. Public meetings and discussions were held all across the country. Frederick Douglass delivered a very powerful speech at Lincoln Hall in Washington, D.C., criticizing the decision. He compared the ruling to other significant setbacks in American history, such as the Dred Scott decision in 1858, when the U.S. Supreme Court said that a black person had no rights that a white person was bound to respect. Douglass said that the ruling was a reflection of the United States' ongoing battle between liberty and slavery, and the country's lack of commitment to liberty and equality when it comes to black people in America. John Mercer Langston, an influential African-American lawyer and educator at the time, he criticized the Supreme Court's decision as absurd and said that it was incomprehensible. Langston compared the history of black people in America to that of the biblical story of the Exodus. He said that the emancipation meant more than just the end of slavery. It meant full citizenship, and that the laws were designed to protect black people from all forms of discrimination, both public and private. I'm not just telling you this just to give you a history lesson. These cases were important because it meant that the South was free to do what it wanted to black people. By striking down the Civil Rights Act of 1875 and upholding segregationist policies, the court set a precedent that encouraged further disenfranchisement and discrimination against African Americans in this country. These cases allowed for segregation. They empowered Jim Crow to enter every aspect of black life. By making the distinction between private and public acts, it meant that the lynching and mob violence against black people could go on without any interference from the federal government, because these were the acts that were carried out by private citizens and not public acts. Between 1882 and 1968, over 4,000 black people were lynched in the United States. The Supreme Court undid all the work that was accomplished on black people's behalf in the Second Founding. Black people actually saw a decline in their civil rights because of the Supreme Court. And that brings me to the story of Laura Nelson and what happened to her and her family in 1911. In the early 1900s, Okemah, Oklahoma was a small town filled with racial tensions that defined much of that era for black people living in the United States. Laura Nelson was born around 1883. In 1896, she married Austin Nelson. They had two children, LD and Carrie. In 1911, LD was about 13 years old and Carrie was 2 years old. On May 1st, 1911, Sheriff Gerald Looney received a complaint from a local white farmer named Claude Luttrell about a stolen cow. Luttrell obtained a search warrant from the Justice of the Peace, A.W. Jenkins, permitting him to search the Nelson's farm. Sheriff Looney assembled a gang of white men, including Luttrell and the neighbor Oscar Lane and Constable Cliff Martin, to execute the search warrant on the Nelson's farm. They came to the Nelson farm around 9 p.m. on May 2nd, 1911. As they began their search, they discovered meat allegedly stolen from the cow that was found in the Nelson's barn. At this point, the situation escalated quickly. 13-year-old LD grabbed a weapon to defend his family. Laura Nelson also armed herself with another weapon. A firefight erupted, during which Constable Martin was grazed in the leg, and Sheriff Looney was fatally struck. Following the altercation, the Nelsons fled to a relative's home but were later arrested that day. The blame fell upon Laura and LD for the entire situation. The entire family, including 2-year-old Carrie, were put in jail. There were serious doubts about the prosecution's case, with many questioning whether the state had enough evidence to actually convict Laura and LD of this crime. As they awaited trial, news of the sheriff's death spread, and anger over the possibility of the Nelsons not being held accountable gripped the white community with anger and wanted revenge. Newspapers started printing sensationalized stories about Laura and about her family. They described Laura as being a wealthy and vicious black woman. LD was described as being tall and ragged, even though he was a child. The white population did not want to wait for a trial. On May 24, 1911, a mob of over 40 white men stormed the jail. They dragged Laura and LD out of their jail cells and took them 6 miles away to a bridge over the Canadian River, close to a black neighborhood. Laura was violated by the men. They then hung Laura and LD from the bridge. Some reports say that baby Carrie was found drowned in the river. Laura and LD's bodies were found the next morning by a young black boy. Hundreds of white people rushed to the scene to see their bodies. Some posted pictures with Laura and LD's bodies. Images of Laura and LD were later turned into postcards and sold as souvenirs. There are photographs of what happened that day at the bridge. I can't show them here for obvious reasons, but you really should see them. you should see what brutality looked like during that time period for black people. See what black people experienced. I've included them on my blog. What happened to Laura Nelson and her son LD happened because of the actions of the Supreme Court in the 1880s, when it abandoned black people and ruled that it was okay for private citizens to harm and discriminate black people, and the federal government had no authority to stop it. Congress passed laws to prevent what happened to Laura and LD, and the Supreme Court overturned those laws. What would black life have looked like after the end of slavery and the Civil War, had the laws that were passed for black people to help black people have been allowed to be enforced the way that they were intended? We'll never know. What we do know is that the Supreme Court is still doing the same thing that it did in 1883, twisting the law to the disadvantage of black people. Had you ever heard the story of Laura Nelson and her son LD? And how does it make you feel knowing that the Supreme Court set the stage for Jim Crow and segregation? Drop me a comment down below and let me know what you think.